Hello friends, for today's video I wanted to do an overview of 20 new fantasy releases that I've picked up so far in 2024. Just to clarify, I think a lot of you know this at this point, but if you're new, in the first quarter of a given year, as a result of there not actually being that many new releases out yet, I allow myself to pick up books that are primarily new releases from the latter half of the previous year and include those in new fantasy releases wrap-ups. So some of the books that will be on this list did technically come out in 2023, but we will of course have releases from 2024. And then on top of that, I have one that is sci-fi, and then I have one that I would say is more so horror than fantasy, but I do know there's a lot of overlap between fantasy readers and these other genres, so I wanted to include them as well. At the end of the video, I have a few awards that I like to give, and some of them are positive things, some of them are just general things, but I do think that adds a little bit of extra fun to the video. But jumping into it, starting with Song of the Six Realms, this story I have compared to Howl's Moving Castle before, as the general setup has a similar feeling. You have a character who is a little bit stuck in life, and then this mysterious individual who seems to have a lot of prestige and a lot of mystery around them ends up kind of whisking this other person off to an area that they suddenly become very much swept away in the goings on of people with a lot of power. This is, I would say, a lot more ethereal. It is whimsical, but I would say it doesn't have as much of the charm to it, as it feels a lot more settled in, and it is quite atmospheric. It does have a big music component to it, which I quite enjoyed. I do think the writing style sort of almost transcends genre, where it has this serious tone to it, but really the word that I would latch onto is that ethereal feel. Next up, we have What Feasts at Night. This is our horror fantasy story. This is a second book in a collection of novellas, the first being a retelling of the fall of the House of Usher. The second one strays away from that. You are following our main character as they are trying to basically get over not only the traumatic events from the first one, but also deal with the PTSD that comes with being a soldier. And that was my favorite part of this. The horror components of the story, while creepy, and I do think T. Kingfisher does this very well, are actually not the things that I would point to and say, oh my gosh, look how great. Which is interesting because I feel like that is kind of the way in which it's presented in its marketing, but truly it was the depictions of PTSD that I was really floored by. After that, we have Dragonfruit. This one feels very much like you're being told a folk tale. You are following somebody who has been essentially cast out of their culture and their society as a result of dragon fruit, which is the eggs of dragons that have magical properties. The magical properties were meant to be used on a certain individual of power. However, our main character's father stole this dragon egg and used that power to save her. And she now has all of this guilt as the person that it was meant for was not able to get it. And so she's on a quest to right this wrong. And through all of that, you get to learn more about her culture, her relationship with the other people that she has essentially left behind, as well as individuals who look to impose on their way of life and even steal so much from them. Next up, we have the Tainted Cup. This is an adult fantasy murder mystery. I would almost argue leans a little bit into sci-fi as well. It truly is a genre bender. You are looking at this really interesting society that is keeping people contained to certain areas, and they have to pay a lot to have the powers that be, will say, protect them from these massive beings known as Leviathans. When Leviathans do come to land, they wreak havoc, and that includes if their bodies are left behind, they wreak havoc on the atmosphere itself, and that affects the plant life. And they use the plant life in their world for a lot of the magical properties. Our main character is somebody who has been enhanced by these plant properties, and people can have enhancements in different ways. So what's interesting to me is when I heard fantasy murder mystery, I was thinking this was going to be a lot more contained, so I was pleasantly surprised to find this really interesting epic fantasy world among all of that as well. Next up, we have The Prisoner's Throne. This is the second book in its given duology. This does take place in the Folk of the Air world, so if you are somebody who likes the Cruel Prince trilogy, this is what transpires after, and you do have some characters that make appearances from the original trilogy, which was a lot of fun to see. I do think that Holly Black continues to capture the twists and turns, the malevolent nature of the Fae, and the wickedness of them within this duology. I think that the world building itself is one of my favorite parts of this. I'm wondering if we're going to get even more within this world. My guess is that we're going to have something to do with the water parts of the Fae, which I hope is true, because if so, I'm really looking forward to that. From there, we have A Fate Inked in Blood. This is the first in a new fantasy romance series that is very much Norse inspired. I do think Danielle Jensen blends fantasy and romance quite well. If you are somebody who's quite picky about that, I think maybe give Danielle Jensen a try. If you prefer more magic in your fantasy, I would say check out A Fate Inked in Blood. If you don't care about the magic as much and you care more about politics, her other series, The Bridge Kingdom, might be for you. But either way, I do think that she balances the fantastical, whether that be through magic or politics, the politics of another world. I think she balances that with the development of the characters and their relationships. In this one, you have a character who has been married to somebody who is very abusive, but is somebody with a lot of power. And then her life kind of gets flipped upside down when that individual suddenly is not as much in the picture, we'll say. And the new people that are in the picture, everybody is trying to use her. For what reason, I don't want to reveal, because I think that's one of the fun things about the opening of the story, is kind of having your usual character type in these sorts of books flipped on their head a little bit. Next up, we have Foxglove. This is the sequel to Belladonna, which is essentially a gothic fantasy story that is a little bit of, you could almost say, a curse murder mystery feel to it. And it is very contained and it is very aesthetic feeling. And then in this second one, we are expanding our perspectives. You have characters that have relationships with beings. So in the first, you have death personified. And in the second, you have another individual personified. And how they butt heads with death personified is interesting to explore. And it's also just interesting to see the personalities of these characters. For me, I do think that Belladonna was a little bit stronger. I think this one has a little drop of middle book syndrome, but not to a point where it's completely dropping the ball with the series. If you like the first one, there's a pretty good chance that you'll enjoy this continuation of the story. Ashes and the Star-Cursed King is next. This is also a second book in a series, and this comes after Serpent and the Wings of Night. Another one that I would say is fantasy romance with a good blend of fantasy and romance. We have a human woman living among vampires. Her father figure is the ruler of the vampires, and that puts a target on her back. She decides to enter a competition that might allow her to attain power so she can defend herself against the vampires. The second book is definitely processing a lot of the events from the first book, and I can't reveal too much more because it is a sequel, and to explore what they're diving into would, of course, ruin the events of the first one. So if you haven't read the first one, I don't want to say too much, but the second one I would say is a little less action oriented and a little bit more personal. Next up, we have Bookshops and Bondust. This is cozy fantasy to the extreme. It is essentially a love letter to readers, to book lovers, to people who just love bookish spaces, and it was precious and it was darling. And you are looking at our main character Viv, who you likely know from the other book in this, as Bookshops and Bondust is a prequel. But rather than being at a later stage in their life looking to settle down and change directions, they are at the beginning of their career. And so you're exploring Viv as she is forced to rest after having an injury, and what she gets into with the local people in the area that she is resting in. Warm Hands of Ghosts is next, and this one is definitely more historical than it is fantasy. It's one of those stories that as you're reading it, you do question if it even is fantasy, and you also question if what seems to be fantastical elements are actually happening or if it's all in your head. So it's very abstract, and it is one of those stories that, while very hard-hitting, it also has such traumatized characters that the writing style is going to reflect that. It's going to be quite choppy. It's going to feel very much like we're just doing the bare minimum because we're just trying to make it day by day and we don't want to have to think too much. And then the abstract portions are where you really dive into the actual metaphorical things, where you dive into the themes of the story. This one was a little bit of a miss for me as the style didn't quite work. However, it's such an artistic choice that I do still really respect that our author decided to navigate the story in this way. And the setup is that you have two main perspectives. They are siblings. One of them seems to be lost at war, and then the other one is determined to find out if that individual that they are related to, their brother, if they have passed away or if they are still alive and they're just simply missing. System Collapse is next. This is the latest entry in the Murderbot Diaries, and this one is very much picking up right where the previous one left off. Our characters are trying to find a way to save a group of people from what is basically like this big bad corporation, and they are trying to convince them of the truth through art, essentially. And it is quite short, as we are returning back to the novella format. Was not my favorite in the Murderbot Diaries, but I did enjoy this continuation, and I look forward to seeing more of Murderbot. Iron Flame is next. This is a sequel to Fourth Wing. It continues to be very angsty. The dragons continue to be very sassy, and our main character, if you don't know, is somebody who is going to a war college, and they get paired up with dragons. It's a very dangerous war college. The students can kill each other, the dragons can kill the students, and if you manage to make it through, you haven't exactly escaped the danger, as then you are expected to protect the realm, we'll say. And there are a lot more things to uncover about the secrets of their nation than our main character, Violet, ever could have imagined, and she is uncovering these secrets alongside her love interest, whose name I won't say in case you haven't read the first book, but you probably know who it is because it's all over the internet. But regardless, it is very angsty, it is very lust heavy, and it is very action packed. It moves very quickly. If that is your thing, then you're probably going to really enjoy this one. Dark Star Burning Ash Falls White is the sequel to Song of Silver Flame Like Night. We do dive a lot more into the lore of this one. In the first one, you are looking at a group of people who have been conquered, and there is a small group that is managing to resist them, and they utilize their magic system, and that goes up against the magic systems of the oppressors. The oppressors are now trying to take the magic from those they have conquered, and you are seeing our main character. She is discovering more about the magic and learning a little bit more about herself and her family in the process. Like I said, the second one dives a lot more into the lore, and then of course you get the conclusion to this, as it is just a duology. Next up we have Starling House. This one follows a young woman who is taking care of her brother, and she is essentially his parental figure. She is doing everything she can. She's essentially put her life on hold, and this mysterious house that so many stories have developed from in the small town that she lives in, this mysterious house has a new individual that shows up, and she ends up working for this individual, and they discover a little bit more about the house and the history of the town. If you like that small town, almost murder mystery feel, then this is one that's probably going to really appeal to you. Tyranny of Faith is next. This is another sequel. We have so many sequels on this list, and this is the sequel to Justice of Kings. I always describe this as following a character who is judge, jury, detective, and executioner all in one, and the story really examines people who are in positions of power and how much power should any one individual hold. And in the second book, that is really expanded on, and you are also seeing what happens when that individual has to abide by the will of others who are only really doing things for their own personal gain, and how messy things can get from there. So I really enjoyed that second one, and I cannot wait to read the third and final book in this series. Next up we have The Will of the Many, which has very much been a booktube darling for a lot of people that have picked this up. This is essentially like if you made Red Rising a lot more fantasy heavy, and if the magic system was very much tied to the themes, which have a lot to do with how complicit are we in the atrocities of the world that occur in the world when we are currently benefiting from the giving up of power to those who then abuse that power and use it against others. And those themes are really interesting, and I am curious to see how we tap into them more in the sequel. As in the first book, it is very much a character who's just trying to kind of break their way into the elites and gain more information. That's where you're going to probably see some parallels to Red Rising. Cage of Dreams and Ruthless Vows are next. These are both sequels to their given duologies. Divine Rivals, of course, I'm sure a lot of you have heard not only me talk about it, but a lot of other people. It's a story that centers on journalists and people that are doing everything they can to reveal the truth about war zones. And in the second book, you're kind of seeing a reversal of one of the narrative and storytelling decisions that was made in the first book. This did, for me, make it feel just a tiny bit repetitive, but I still overall absolutely love this duology. I think its themes are so impactful, so significant, and I also really like the love story within this. And then Cage of Dreams is so bizarre. You are following a society where essentially your nightmares can become real, and so you're looking at society as they are trying to deal with that. However, society is filled with people who are just out to get whatever they can and squeeze the rest of society dry, and so it's so cutthroat. People are being murdered left and right everywhere, which isn't funny. It's just the book is so weird and zany, and like the way in which people die is weird. It's super morbid and also super funny, and also examines PTSD really, really well. So it is a little bit more of a niche, but if you like abstract, zany, bizarre stories and you're looking for something unique, Cage of Dreams and its first book, City of Nightmares, are probably going to fit that for you. The Unmaking of June Farrow is our next book on this list, and this is one where you're following a young woman who has always had weird things related to her family and the way in which they start to seemingly lose their sanity, and then everything gets turned on its head when suddenly she finds herself talking to people and being in what seems to be a different time period, and she is trying to piece together what on earth is going on, not just for her, but this generational curse, you could say. And I think it has very much the feeling of watching a movie. If you are somebody who likes stories that feel very cinematic, then I think there's a good chance that you'll enjoy this one. Curse for True Love is the third and final book in its Given trilogy. This is very much like fairy tale tropes to the extreme. It is very self-aware while simultaneously paying homage and utilizing a lot of the tropes and cliches we've seen before. That does result in it being a very over-the-top story and just nonsensical almost, but you are following a young woman who in the first book was turned to stone, and then when she was turned back into a human, her life suddenly became such a whirlwind, and she is kind of constantly within the same vicinity of this very mysterious individual who holds a lot of power, and then she also ends up in a kingdom, an area where it just seems like magic and magical beings are left and right. And she's just trying to survive, basically, this entire situation. And then last for today, we have Map of the Otherlands. The first book in the series, Encyclopedia of Fairies, as the title tells you, is about a woman in academia who is studying the Fae. It does have very much of a historical fantasy feel, and this main character is somebody who, when she goes to research the Fae in this rural area, she is very academic, but she is also very introverted, and she needs to gain some information from the locals. She's not very good at this, and then her co-worker tags along and kind of fills in the areas that she would rather not deal with, and the two of them work together. They banter, they butt heads, but they bring out both the best and the worst in each other in a very comical, fun way. But of course, in researching the Fae, you start to learn more about them and how sinister and tricky they can be. So that is the first one, and the second one we are expanding on that. We're in a new location, and the relationship between our characters is changing, and there are other characters that tag along. It's a lot of fun. Highly recommend, especially if you like Fae that are more folklore inspired. As for the awards for this, first up we have what I consider to be the most underhyped and or underrated. That would be Cage of Dreams. I'm not allowed to have repeat answers, so there are some other ones that I might also categorize under this award, but for me, I think this is pretty underrated. I know it's really niche, but I think it just needs to find its audience, as I do think there are a lot of people that appreciate the zany and the weird. After that, I normally have best debut, but if I'm not mistaken, not a single one of these was a debut. It was either a sequel or a book by an author who has other works out. So it's kind of fun, because if you do check any of these out, that does mean that there are other books by these authors that you can then go to when you're done. Best sequel, this one was so tough, but I had to give it to Tyranny of Faith, just because everything that I enjoyed about the first book, I think the second book expanded on, which is really what you want out of a sequel, is kind of all you can ask for. Then we have what was probably my absolute favorite. I don't know. I really don't know. I couldn't decide. I put Ruthless Vows, not because I think it as a single book is the best, but because as a duology, I did really, really, really love this one, and I think its themes are just and the focus of who the heroes are of the story is very different than what I typically see, and I really appreciated that, and I think it combines its themes with a very pretty love story. I think it does all of that really nicely. Next up, we have my most unpopular opinion, and this could be looked at a few different ways. We could literally look at what's an average rating that is really low, but I would have given something 5 stars, or the reverse, that I would have given something a really low rating when it has an extremely high average rating. But instead, I'm going to look at this as the circles that I am within on BookTube. What is the book that stands out as being the most loved that I'm maybe a little bit more on the fence about? And that would be, and I kind of alluded to this while talking about it, The Will of the Many. It's not that I disliked this, or that if I were to assign a star rating, I wouldn't assign a low one. I just think that I'm not quite swept away just yet. I am still planning to pick up the sequel and see where it goes, but I think I'm waiting to see how the rest of the story plays out. Next up is what I call the bandwagon passenger. So there are certain books that are popular and it feels like, okay, are you a part of the bandwagon just yet? And there are certain ones, almost like Passenger Princess, like, okay, yeah, I want to be included in this. I want to be on this bandwagon. And for me, that would be Bookshops and Bondust. I was a little unsure. I was actually a little unsure about the first one, and then I ended up really liking it. So when I picked this one up, I was like, can lightning strike twice? Am I going to enjoy this one also? And I am happy to say I definitely really did. And I'm with all those other individuals that also find this precious and cozy. And last, we have a book that has really well done themes, or in this case, a novella. And I went ahead and gave this to What Feasts at Night, just because I was really taken aback by how impactful I found the representation of PTSD. So that would be it for the new releases that I checked out in the first half of this year. For the last half of the year, when I do this video again, it will solely be releases from 2024. I will have in-depth reviews or new fantasy releases wrap-ups for every single one of these. But thanks so much for watching. I hope you have a great rest of your day. I would love to know what has been your favorite new release that you have picked up. It can be a new release from this year or last year. That's completely fine. I would love to know, and I would love to maybe try to check it out and put it on my TBR for the second half of this year. But have a great rest of your day, and I'll see you later.